Genesis chapter 6 marks a turning point in the Bible's narrative. We move from the creation story and early human history to the story of Noah and the flood. This chapter sets the stage for a dramatic intervention by God. The world had become filled with wickedness and violence. God, grieved by the corruption he saw, decided to cleanse the earth and start anew. This chapter introduces us to Noah. He stands out as a beacon of righteousness in a world consumed by evil. The chapter also hints at the mysterious Nephilim. They are powerful beings who contribute to the escalating chaos and wickedness on earth. Genesis chapter 6 is a powerful reminder of the consequences of sin and disobedience. It also highlights the importance of righteousness and obedience to God. The story of Noah and the flood serves as a warning. It reminds us that God's judgment, though often slow, is always certain. Genesis chapter 6 paints a bleak picture of the world before the flood. Humanity had multiplied and spread across the earth, but their hearts were filled with wickedness. The text tells us that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. It also says that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6:5. The Bible doesn't specify the exact nature of this wickedness. However, we can infer from the context that it involved violence, injustice, and a disregard for God. The world had become a place where evil reigned unchecked. Humanity had strayed far from the path of righteousness and holiness that God intended. This description of widespread wickedness serves as a stark contrast to the righteousness of Noah. It highlights the depth of human depravity that grieved God's heart. The world had become so corrupted that God saw no other solution but to intervene and cleanse the earth. One of the most intriguing and debated passages in Genesis chapter 6 is the account of the sons of God taking wives from the daughters of men. Genesis 6:1-4. The identity of these sons of God has been a subject of much speculation and interpretation throughout history. Some interpret the sons of God as fallen angels. They believe these angels rebelled against God and mated with human women. This interpretation is based on other biblical texts that mention fallen angels. However, this view is not without its challenges. Another interpretation suggests the sons of God were descendants of Seth. Seth was a son of Adam and Eve. This interpretation views the daughters of men as descendants of Cain, another son of Adam and Eve. This view sees the intermarriage as a transgression of God's boundaries. It led to the further corruption of the human race. Adding to the intrigue of Genesis chapter 6 is the mention of the Nephilim. These were powerful beings who lived both before and after the flood. The text describes them as the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Genesis 6:4. Their presence on earth is linked to the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men. The Bible doesn't provide much detail about the Nephilim. This lack of information has led to various interpretations of their nature and role in the biblical narrative. Some believe they were giants, possibly the offspring of the sons of God and human women. Their size and strength would have set them apart from ordinary humans. This difference may have contributed to their renown. Others interpret the Nephilim more symbolically. They see them as representing the increasing wickedness and violence that had engulfed humanity. This interpretation emphasizes the escalating chaos and corruption in the world before the flood. Section 5. God's sorrow and anger. Genesis chapter 6 reveals a profound truth about God. He is not indifferent to the suffering and sin of humanity. The text tells us that the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Genesis 6:6. This language, while anthropomorphic, conveys the depth of God's sorrow and disappointment at the state of the world. God's grief is not a sign of weakness or regret. It reveals his deep love for his creation and his pain at seeing it consumed by evil. The Hebrew word for regretted can also be translated as relented or was sorry. This translation suggests that God's decision to judge the world was not made lightly. It was a painful choice, driven by his love for humanity and his desire for righteousness. The text also speaks of God's anger. His anger was not a capricious or uncontrolled emotion. It was a righteous response to the wickedness and injustice that pervaded the world. God's anger is an expression of his holiness, his justice, and his love for what is good and right. Section 6. Noah, a righteous man in a corrupt world. In the midst of widespread wickedness, Genesis chapter 6 introduces us to Noah. He is a beacon of hope and righteousness in a world desperately in need of redemption. The text describes Noah as a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Genesis 6:9. This description sets Noah apart from his contemporaries. It highlights his unwavering faithfulness to God in a time of widespread apostasy. Noah's righteousness was not merely external conformity to religious rules. It was a deep, abiding commitment to living in accordance with God's will. His life stood in stark contrast to the corruption that surrounded him. This righteousness made him the perfect candidate for God's plan to preserve a remnant of humanity. Noah's story reminds us that even in the darkest of times, God always preserves a faithful remnant. It is through those who remain true to Him that God continues to work His purposes in the world. Section 7. The Covenant with Noah. In the midst of judgment, God extends a covenant of grace to Noah. This covenant is a testament to God's faithfulness and mercy. It is a promise that even though He will bring judgment upon the earth, He will also preserve life. God instructs Noah to build an ark. This ark will serve as a refuge for him, his family, and representatives of every living creature. This ark is a symbol of God's preservation and His promise to make a fresh start with humanity. The covenant with Noah is not just a story about judgment and survival. It is a story about God's faithfulness to His promises and His desire to redeem His creation. The covenant with Noah is significant because it marks the beginning of a new era in God's relationship with humanity. It is a promise that despite human sin and rebellion, God will never completely abandon His creation. Section 8. Building the Ark, a monumental task. God's instructions to Noah about building the ark were detailed and specific. He was to build a massive vessel, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. This ark was to be made of gopher wood and covered inside and out with pitch. It was to have 3 decks, rooms, a door in its side, and a window for light. The construction of the ark would have been a monumental task, requiring immense resources, skill, and perseverance. It's a testament to Noah's faith and obedience that he undertook this seemingly impossible project. He trusted God's word and obeyed His commands, even though the idea of a worldwide flood must have seemed preposterous at the time. The ark was not just a means of survival, it was a symbol of hope, a tangible expression of God's promise to preserve a remnant of His creation. Section 9. Preparations and Provisions. Building the ark was only part of God's instructions to Noah. He was also commanded to bring into the ark 2 of every kind of living creature, male and female, to keep them alive throughout the coming flood. Noah was also to gather enough food for himself, his family, and all the animals. The task of gathering and caring for all these animals would have been overwhelming. Yet, the Bible tells us that Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. Genesis 6:22. This simple statement speaks volumes about Noah's faith and obedience. He didn't question God's commands. He simply trusted and obeyed. The preparations for the flood emphasize the importance of obedience and trust in God's plan. Even though the situation seemed dire, Noah remained faithful, trusting that God would provide and fulfill His promises. Section 10. A Glimmer of Hope, the Promise of a New Beginning. Genesis chapter 6 ends on a somber note, with the world on the brink of destruction. However, amidst the impending judgment, there's a glimmer of hope. God's covenant with Noah and the construction of the ark represent a promise of a new beginning. The flood, though catastrophic, is not the end of the story. It is a new beginning, a chance for God to cleanse the earth and start afresh with a righteous remnant. The story of Noah and the flood serves as a reminder that God is both just and merciful. He judges sin, but He also offers redemption and hope. The story of Noah is a story of faith, obedience, and hope. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, God is always faithful to His promises. It also reminds us that God can bring renewal and hope even out of judgment and destruction.